So US budgetary deficit is here. In 2020, 3 trillion budget deficit. 2021, 2.5 trillion, well, 2.7 or so. And 2022's data isn't in yet, but we are looking at 1.38 trillion. So, because to give it a comparative size, here is spending 6.2 trillion, revenue 4.9 billion, deficit 1.3, revenue 4.9 trillion, deficit 1.3 trillion. So is sending T-70s and guys with rusted bayonets against people who spend $1 million on cruise missiles to hit a $10,000 camel. Is this the idea of forcing the US economy to crash and getting them out of the war through that? Because if the East truly believes that the neutrals will not bribe the US to stay in the war, I consider that very silly. So are they looking at the data from the Corona years and looking at what if they pump like 3 or 4 more years to deficit of around 2 trillion, and then just watch the US economy crumble? Because I think that might be a realistic goal, because the US has such a large debt and deficit that pushing their economy very hard by sending stuff that is cheap for the East to build against expensive Western gear might be the style they took down the Axis with. So it's not an inconceivable strategy. But from what I see, probability is that the US will decrease its own spending and demand that its allies step from, say, 2% GDP to NATO to perhaps even 3% GDP to NATO. And that will solve most of the problems for the US, because it just seems like kind of foolish to believe that the US economy will crash that bad with these numbers. They're bad numbers. I'm not saying they're good numbers. And the US is undergoing rapid inflation, which might even speed up to hyperinflation, but that's unlikely. But if this is their motivation, then I would consider it to be a little silly to bet all you have on perhaps 1% chance that your enemy will collapse. That's something that I wouldn't do. Granted, the timing in terms of East's potential windows to cause a military collapse of the West, in terms of that specific timing, it's not badly timed. But the probability of such an operation being a success when the US economy is still considered, even by China, to be triple B at the lowest, and most of its allies consider it at least an AA or A rank economy, while the rest are triple A's. The chances, even when your supposed core economy of the East thinks they're still at BBB, while being in default is like 1D or 1C, is foolish. Now, if the US was at C credit rating, might be reasonable, but not while they can still literally sell their foreign bases to cover their debts. That's not a good chance to win. So that's the mood I had for this and the idea I had for this. So, uh, I mean, it's conceivable they're aiming for the economic window, but it seems if they are, that it's a pretty unlikely thing to manifest because the US economy is still very strong. And it wouldn't take much, like, say, lengthening the work week from 30 hours or whatever it is to 40 hours to cover that gap. So I wouldn't risk going to war when your enemy's economy is still that good. And that is perhaps the most likely thing I'm looking at. And in the in the geopolitical simulator that I'm playing, I think just raising the pollution tax to maximum would almost cover that deficit. Would hurt the economy by making the average GDP per capita from 68,000 to 63,000, but it would solve the CO2 as well as the budget deficit. So I wouldn't aim for that small a window if I was trying to take down the West. I wouldn't. I would completely ignore it. If I really wanted to take down the West, I would play isolationist Japan. I wouldn't play oil selling Russia. That's not the strategy of taking down the West. So perhaps because Russia has, say, 15, 20% GDP to debt ratio, the US has about 100. Maybe they're realistically really betting that the US economy will collapse if it's pushed hard after the Afghanistan and COVID debacles. But I do believe if that is their thinking, then they are seriously underestimating the US and the West's support for it. So that is all. Thank you for watching.